mainstay of these Medicans. I think he's been to every Mardi Gras in 27 years, except maybe one he missed when he was in jail. Last year he missed in jail. But he's he is the Australian pioneer of getting the word out there on cannabis. Since he was a teenager, industrial hemp, especially in the beginning, and because he's a doctor, you know, obviously he's practiced. So he's been up against the system for years. It's really appreciate him coming up from Sydney to talk to us again. You can pick his brains. And then I've got Malcolm Lee to talk to you before the end of the day. And I want to remind you the movie High as Mike is on here tonight at 6:30. It's had great, I haven't seen it, I'm going to watch it tonight. It's had good raves everywhere. And there'll be dinner on down here, and the movie probably goes for an hour and a half, and the producer of the movie's here. There'll be a panel afterwards. So it's all happening tonight. It's all free except the movie, you've got to pay $10. But I recommend stay on. Anyway, where's the doc? Getting things right. I went to Andrew's house in Sydney years ago. Everything was hemp. He's built. At the back, he'd experimented and built everything out of hemp. This is a plant that could, us hippies used to say, it's a plant that can save the world. The only problem is it's illegal. It's incredibly fast growing. It has a unique, strong, flexible fibre for building. It's an amazingly nutritious seed. It's a superfood, the seed. It's only been legal a year now or so, and you'll see it's out in Woolworths already. It's a total superfood. And it's an amazing medicine. So you can see why, probably 150 years ago, it was the most grown plant on the whole planet. It was so good for everything. So making it illegal benefited lots of industries. And it happened to coincide with the arrival of petrochemicals and the pharmaceutical industry. That's all happening in 1930. So, making cannabis illegal and the opium poppy, those two were in every medicine pretty much. You've cornered the pain relief market. Here he is. Thanks, Doc. Good on you. Andrew Katelaris. Dr. Pot. He doesn't like to be called Dr. Pot, do you?
There's worse things I've been called. That was a very important talk by Megan there. There's a few things that I find profoundly disturbing, and one of the most disturbing was the fact that a neighbour dobbed them in. Right? Profoundly disturbing because it happens so often. Now, I've been around the sun enough times to watch this country change dramatically, certainly in the last 30 years. Right? When I was a boy, to do what we call dobbing was probably one of the most disgraceful activities you could possibly do. But then the social engineers came up with Operation Noah. Does everyone remember that? Narcotics, opiates, amphetamines and heroin or something like that. And the byword was dob in a dealer. Right? Dob in a dealer. And they've completely changed the social climate of this country. Right? Even when I was sort of involved in disputes and problems as a teenager, I was essentially very proud to be an Australian. Right? I can't say the same anymore. Right? It's disgrace. And I've heard from international friends, what has happened to Australia? Right? What has happened to us? Are we young and free? We're not young and free now. We're a bunch of overweight half-wits. I'm talking collectively with many exceptions. No, seriously, this is a serious topic, right? To watch the moral degeneration of a country's substance is a very sad thing. How did we go from being a rather progressive country? And remember, Australia did have a fairly proud tradition going back to the early parts of the 1900s of social reform, and it attracted international attention of things like universal suffrage, control of working hours. All these things that we take for granted now only existed because our social innovation started here. But now where have we gone? We're dragging sick people out of their cars and prosecuting them. Right? The only thing we can be assured of is if we do nothing, things will get worse. I'm not saying that exerting all our effort will make things better, but you can be totally certain that doing nothing is going to end up with a situation much worse than what we're in. Just have a look at the origins of the saliva tests. Firstly, as I understand it, I've been informed, they were brought in by a bunch of corrupt Victorian police for their own profit. These are tests, the saliva test, the Draeger test, that have never been proved to be reliable in terms of avoiding false positives, so 20% of the tests are false positives. And even the police admit they're not associated with improving road use outcomes, which should be the only way that the police are actually involved. So they've moved without a shadow of shame on their part from blood alcohol testing, which is a reasonable and a proven way of assuring road safety, to a social control measure. Now, more and more people were successfully running legal challenges to a saliva test. And it's interesting that all the activists around here, myself, Michael, Andrew Katelaris, we've all been targeted and with saliva tests, right? I was lucky when I came before a magistrate for my saliva test. He was a magistrate that refused me bail on the medical cannabis charge, and I could lay a very heavy guilt trip on him about what he'd done. So I sort of walked away from that one with no real problems at all, but most people aren't that fortunate. Now, just to make it worse, the laws have now been changed, so the mere positivity on the test is enough to get your licence lost immediately with no chance of appearing before a magistrate and arguing your case, right? What's the next thing from dragging motorists out of the cars? How about dragging people out of protest and doing a saliva test on them? That's where these things logically follow. And what seems absurd at one stage suddenly becomes normal practice. You imagine 20 years ago someone said you're going to be dragged out of your car and someone's going to rub your tongue with a stick, and if it turns to a red colour, you'll be dragged off to jail. You say, oh, I don't think so. But that's exactly what's happening. Right. Now, I'm not sure who I'm talking to here. Are most people here because of loved ones or themselves with medical issues? Is that the predominant reason for being? Yeah, okay. Unfortunately now, medicine and politics are very, very unfortunate bedfellows, right? And we can't fix our medical system without fixing our political system. Now, how many people here voted for the hemp party? Ah, good, we're amongst supporters, right? We were very encouraged by the result during that Senate election, and I thank the people up at the hemp embassy who did all the background work to make that possible. But as I understand it, we got something like 2.6% of the vote, which is very similar to what Clive Palmer got for the expending of $60 million. So it's something to build on. I think, though, we really have to look at that as an encouraging start and spend the next 3 years making a serious effort to educate people. Now, I'm straying away from medicine for a bit, but like I said, you can't divorce politics from medicine. My position, and I think the position generally amongst law reform people, is that the supply of cannabis has to be multifactorial. By that I mean a 3-tier supply. And starting at a non-negotiable position, we need to be able to grow cannabis at home for our own use, right? Now, non-negotiable on that, right? We heard from Megan that... Morgan, sorry, mate. We heard from Morgan that the benefits of raw cannabis. Now, we were at a conference organised by United in Compassion up at the Gold Coast about a month or so ago, and all the scientists that came from America and Israel started talking about the additional health benefits of unheated or raw cannabis, the THCA and the CBDA. After hearing that talk, I went out to the assembled sort of commercial people out there offering their various cannabis medicines, and I asked them, where is your CBDA preparation? Where is your THCA? And none of them offered any unheated cannabis, right? So we've developed a schizophrenic situation where the science is telling us one thing and the politics is telling us an entirely different thing, right? The three-tier supply system that we envisage, apart from home growing, the next level is proxy growing. There's a lot of people that derive a great deal of self-satisfaction, myself included, and a lot of people up here, of growing cannabis carefully and lovingly, providing it to people in need and watching a transformation of their lives. Now, not everyone we treat recovers. In fact, many of them die because they approach us at a very late stage in the evolution of their disease. But the beauty of cannabis is that even when it fails in a primary therapeutic option of reversing a disease, say cancer, it usually provides a substantial amount of benefit to the person. And that can't be said for most allopathic drugs, right? The allopathic drugs are guaranteed to come with a raft of side effects. And it's so against the basic Hippocratic philosophy of primum non nocere. That's first do no harm, right? So the idea of using a chemotherapeutic drug, which is a very fine balance between benefit and harm, is totally antipathetic to Hippocratic medicine, to natural health. What are we doing? When I was first studying medicine in the 1970s, the health budget was something like $10 billion. I don't know what it is now, but 3 years ago it was $60 billion, right? The pharmaceutical industry produce a whole raft of new and evolving medicines. So they're moving away from ordinary chemical medicines now, and they're coming up with what they call biologics, various antibodies and various immune modulating drugs, right? But they're very, very non-specific. One of them is what they call the checkpoint inhibitors. This is a fascinating drug that actually undoes the control mechanisms that it's a bit like a leash on a dog. Say the immune system has got the attack cells, the natural killer cells, and a whole range of things like that. This removes the restraints on that system. And indeed, in 20% of the people that receive these checkpoint inhibitors, they have a fairly dramatic anti-cancer effect, and you see a physical reduction in the tumour. But in an equal number, the system goes AWOL and the people suffer with severe autoimmune disease, and many of them die. And in fact, the balance between risk and benefit, it depends on a lottery. Are you in the 20% that respond favourably or the 20% that die? But who do you read about in the newspapers here, which is really just the cheerleaders for pharmaceutical cannabis? You see the miracle one, oh, I owe my life to Keytruda, or I owe my life to this or that. We have a very, very unholy alliance where we've got politicians who've invested heavily in pharmaceuticals, and they're the ones, like Turnbull, right? And I put a lot of the blame of what's happened in this country on Turnbull, because he had a choice some years ago when this first started happening to put the control of the production, manufacture and distribution of cannabis under an independent regulator. Instead, he put it under the TGA, or the Therapeutic Goods Administration. It's very much like leaving the cat to mind the pigeons, and that's what he's done. The way I see things at the moment is they've exchanged a legal prohibition for a medical prohibition, right? Now, I don't want to be too bitter and twisted about medical practitioners generally, because I know there's a large number of quality medical practitioners, but amongst the oncologists and amongst the people at the higher levels of administration, there is an almost sociopathic lack of empathy for what people are going through, right? Why is it better? Why did Morgan have to go through every bizarre toxic drug invented by pharmaceutical companies before she could try something else, right? Now, where is the way forward? We're not really a democracy in this country. I was trying to get a slide up, which I'll have ready for tomorrow. It's a quote by Edward Zare. who says that a country that's populated by apathetic and ill-informed individuals and run by a financially motivated, corrupt government is not a democracy at all, right? And that's where we are at the moment, right? Now, I don't want to make this talk a downer, right? Because at the end of the day, the purpose of these meetings is not only to educate, but to stimulate, right? In the next 3-year electoral cycle, okay, we might get lucky, and with a lot of hard work, we might end up with a senator in the Australian Parliament. That by itself is not going to change something, but I'll tell you what, if we do put the effort in and we do get that position, the people in power will not have a quiet moment from the moment they wake up to the moment they have their troubled sleep, because that position can be used to prick the conscience of the people that trade pharmaceutical profits, and these are international profits, for the health of their population, right? It's a serious, serious business. Now, which way is there forward besides the political way forward? What I elected to do about 1.5 years ago was to test the court system using what we call a medical necessity defence. You're sort of vaguely familiar with this history. I was arrested after going on a TV show. I mean, I expected to be arrested. I didn't expect to spend 6 months in a maximum security remand prison, I must admit that. So the government flippantly wasted $60,000 incarcerating me, and now they're going to have to pay more than that in compensation by the time our court cases are finished. But yeah, and it'll be used for good purpose to advance the cause. But the purpose of that was to fire the first shot in a repeated episode of using the jury system, right? The jury system, the courts alone will do nothing. So many judges have told me that they're creatures of statute. By that, they mean they don't have free choice or the ability to use their conscience. They must follow the law. And I said, well then, you're a slave to the law rather than a servant of justice. And most of them agree, yes, yeah, you got it right there. I said, are you aware of what you've just said? But that's the people we're dealing with. They might be pulling $300,000 or $400,000 salaries, but they have the moral stature of reptiles, basically, right? I mean, my experience in life, of nearly into my 7th decade of life, is that there's 3 sorts of people. There's people with a conscience that act on that conscience, and they're the only people that really are proper human beings. They're people completely without conscience, without a moral conscience. They're psychopaths or sociopaths, right? And then there's the masses that have a conscience but are too timid to use it, right? And remember, it's the greatest treason against yourself to do nothing because you can only do a little bit. Do you follow that? Right? Doing a little bit, writing a letter, speaking to someone. Just do anything at all other than being quiet. Okay? Is that a deal? Yeah. All right. Now, we'll get on to a bit more medicine. Okay. Even though I sort of carry the name of Dr. Pot, I mean, often during my consultations, the subject of cannabis only comes up in a minor way, and the people sometimes go, oh, I came to see Dr. Pot, you know, where's the pot? Sort of thing. Right? I'm not denigrating or ignoring the massive therapeutic benefits of carefully chosen and dispensed cannabis. But in the long term, it's all about having a properly functioning endocannabinoid system. Now, that's a word that's tossed around willy-nilly, and most people don't really understand anything about it. And to a large degree, that involves myself. It's a story in the making. The simplistic idea we have about the endocannabinoid system is nowhere near the whole story. It's a bit like the view we've got of the universe before the telescope was invented, right? And suddenly the reality becomes a lot larger. But there's a few critical points that have to be internalised so you can take advantage of the knowledge that's evolving. Now, unlike all other control, like most other systems in the body, like the endocrine system and the nervous system, the immunological system, they're all one-horse races, basically. They all do one thing. The endocannabinoid system regulates them all, but it regulates them in a really mysterious manner. I'll just try and convey what I mean by that. You've all heard about anandamide? Anandamide? That's the natural cannabinoid that's made by the body, and it's the one that's named by the Sanskrit word meaning bliss, because the people who came across it seem to think when the endocannabinoid system's working ideally, you're in a state as good as you can actually get, and that's probably true, right? But where does the anandamide come from, right? This is the strange part of it. The cell, and as anyone, I gave a whole talk on this a couple of sessions ago, and the graphics, looks like I've copied them wrongly and they haven't come out, so you'll just have to imagine what I'm trying to tell you. Our body is made of cells, right? And the cells are made of a cell membrane. And the cell membrane is what they call a lipid trilayer. It's just a layer of what they call hydrophobic and hydrophilic components. By that I mean some of them love water and some of them hate water. So they self-assemble with the ones that don't like water turning in on themselves and the ones that like water on the inside and the outside of the cell turning out. Right? It's a beautiful one. The more biology you study, you marvel at the poetry of the self-assembly of things. For instance, when you make a protein in the body, the protein is a whole string of amino acids, and it's made of a string, but when they come together, they fold automatically by the distribution of charges, right? There's just a degree of intelligence in the body that leaves you speechless much of the time. But coming back to the cell membranes, the anandamide, this internal cannabinoid, right, it actually is made directly out of the cell membrane when needed. That's the way the textbooks are describing it. It's created on demand when needed, but everyone remains silent as to what intelligence is governing this, right? If you study something like the endocrine system, say the thyroid gland, right? Very, very briefly, you've got a thyroid stimulating hormone which stimulates the thyroid and it puts out thyroxine. Right? If the thyroxine level goes too high, the TSH drops and then the stimulation, it's a classical negative feedback loop. And that's really, really easy to understand. There's the controller and the responder. If the response is too high, the control drops down and everything regulates. The magic and the mystery of the endocannabinoid system is that the anandamide is made on demand out of the cell membrane. Right? If you're all a bit puzzled, I'm puzzled too, right? Because no one has the faintest idea of what intelligence is driving that. Do you follow? Right? But, and this is where we can actually impact on it, and this is the purpose of that fairly long introduction. If you have a lifetime of the wrong fats and lipids intaken, that means if you've been eating processed food, you've got a ton of trans fats and overly saturated fats and all these other things that have built up your cells because your body can only make the cells out of what you provide. Right? So say, for instance, take a typical case on the SAD diet. You know, the SAD diet is a standard American diet. Hot dog and chips and all the other rubbish that goes out with lashings of high fructose corn syrup and all the other disasters that they've come to refer to as their food, right? Your cell membranes don't function correctly, right? And you simply cannot make anandamide because how can you build a solid house out of defective bricks, basically, right? So the message here is how do we assure that the lipids that go into our body are the right lipids, and what are they anyway, right? Now, one of the biggest battles of my life was getting, even more so than having cannabis legalised, was getting hemp seed legalised. Because in my mind, hemp seed is a perfect building block for healthy bodies, right? As you're possibly aware from the literature that's been distributed, the hemp seed has an ideal ratio of omega-3 and omega-6, Do you all know this, or do you want to hear this? You want to hear it? Okay, there's two essential fatty acids, right? Omega-3 and omega-6. Now, they have opposite functions. Just like in the body, muscles have opposite function. Like my biceps pulls my arm this way, my triceps pull my arm that way, and the tone of my arm is governed by competing tension, right? And it works very well. Obviously, we're walking and talking and carrying on. The same thing happens with omega-3 and omega-6, right? They're both used to make chemical messages in the body called prostaglandins and leukotrienes, and these things have opposing functions. Omega-6 creates prostaglandins that have an inflammatory effect, and your body needs a certain degree of inflammation to ward off infection and immune healing and a whole lot of other processes, whereas omega-3 has the opposite effect. It turns it down, right? Now, the standard American diet, the SAD diet, has a massive predominance of omega-6, right? Sometimes they've been measured in people's fat at up to 10 to 1, whereas the ideal ratio is 3 to 1. So you should have 3 parts of 6 to 1 part of 3, and then you're in balance. You have the right amount of inflammation, but not too much, and the inflammation is terminated when it's no longer used, right? It's pretty simple in principle. So if you're eating too much omega-6, and remember the diets in this country are full of omega-6. Almost all processed food is just completely devoid of omega-3 and full of omega-6. So the population generally is in a state of constant, unrelieved inflammation. And the only difference between each individual is where that inflammation lands. And these by factors we don't understand. You can call it genetics, you can call it something else, I don't know. But some people's inflammation are almost exclusively on their arteries and they end up with heart attacks. Others are on their joints and they end up with various forms of arthritis. But the underlying inflammatory condition is the same, right? Let's say your membranes have got a predominance of omega-6 in them. How are you going to make an anandamide? The answer is you're not, because you can't. And you have a hypofunctioning or an endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome. Now, whatever benefit the various preparations of cannabis have, and like I said, I'm not denigrating the relief that people can get in chronic pain and inflammatory disorders from using cannabis, but it must be married with a much more mature and self-aware approach to what you eat, right? I mean, I've said it till I'm hoarse in voice that most people dig their grave with their knife and fork, right? It's a sad fact. I mean, are we here just to enjoy the sort of the transient pleasure of some processed foods taste on our taste buds? No. We're meant to eat food and choose the food we eat to optimise our functioning so we can do something useful with our lives, right? That's what we want to do. And I presume I share that as a commonality with everyone here, if not people in Canberra, right? What can I say? There's a few refinements that have to go on. The whole medical dialogue concerning omega-3 has centred around seafood, right? All the experiments that have been done with what they call EPA and DHA, which are elongated animal-based omega-3s. They're not the essential fatty acid. The essential fatty acid is a plant-based one called alpha-linolenic acid. When animals eat that, they enter the omega-3 into the food chain, right? So the only reason, for instance, fish, like salmon and things like that, have high levels of omega-3 is because they eat little things that have high levels of omega-3. So if you're in a fish farm situation and you feed your fish rubbish, is what they do to save money, the fish is rubbish, right? Last time I think I spoke to, I talked about Fukushima, or Fukushima, I think as the Australians like to call it. Is everyone keeping up to date with what's going on there? It's the largest nuclear disaster in human history, and it dwarfs every other nuclear disaster that's ever occurred combined, right? I read 3 days ago there was a Richter 6 earthquake up on the northeastern coast of Japan. Now at Fukushima, there's building 4, which was involved in the explosion during the initial meltdown, right? It illegally holds 10 years of spent fuel rods. 10 years worth. They're meant to only keep 1 year's worth. So they've got 1,200 fuel rods there. The explosion, the hydrogen gas explosion, blew out one of the legs of building 4. So we've got a building on the 4th floor of which is an Olympic-sized swimming pool with 1,200 nuclear fuel rods in it, right? They're sending robots in to have a look at what's going on. The gamma radiation is so hot that the robots are dying, right? The meltdown that's occurring, the nuclear fire, has already gone through a huge amount of steel in the containment vessel, a huge amount of concrete in the secondary containment vessel, and is now bubbling into the dirt. And TEPCO, the company responsible, made this ludicrous suggestion that they were going to dig a kilometre-long trench and install freezing bars in it to try and freeze the groundwater and keep it frozen to stop the radiation running away in the groundwater. Now, they couldn't keep the electricity going to the power plant. How are they going to keep the electricity going indefinitely to a freezing column a kilometre long? It's really absurd and very serious. Now, why did I bring that up? Omega-3, the predominant source at this stage is seafood. But in the very near future, unfortunately, and there's already an enormous amount of radioactive contamination in the Pacific Ocean. Cesium was detected on the west coast of the US a year after the event. And you know what the Americans did? They doubled the safety level, right, of what they consider safe for cesium, and then stopped testing. Right? I mean, if you think I've lost the plot and I think we're governed by psychopaths, you can think that. But we are governed by psychopaths. And they appear to be rushing to some sort of destruction. I don't know what's motivating them. I really don't. But they've managed to throw a blanket of silence over that whole event. Now, luckily, there is a way out, at least nutritionally, and that's the hemp seed, right? Coming back to where we started. And it's always good to end up with something positive. The hemp seed yeah, we're facing certain destruction, but we've got some hemp seed to eat well. No, it's serious business, because a population without adequate amount of omega-3 is going to suffer with the escalating health issues that we're all suffering from. High blood pressure, arthritis, cancer. All sorts of things are exacerbated by this imbalance in the state of unquenched inflammation, right? The beauty of the hemp seed, and unlike the fish oils, is that because you're taking the native or the essential form of omega-3, the alpha-linolenic acid, your body can convert that to DHA and EPA when needed. If you just eat some fish, and remember that most of the fish now is cultured, and they're hanging their hat on the fact that an analysis was done on some cold water fish some years ago when they were eating a good diet. So the cultured fish have almost no omega-3. Like, I tried to interest the fish farmers some years ago in hemp seed as a way of feeding the fish to ensure they'd be the healthiest possible. But they said, look, you know, you want us to spend $2,000 or $3,000 a tonne on this food? Oh, we can get rendered rubbish, you know, for $600, and that's what we're going to feed them, right? And you're all the ones that suffer. Now, there's one thing that you must be aware, because even though hemp seed is a wonderful food, it only provides the omega-3 and 6 in the ratio that's good for long-term maintenance, in the 1-to-3 ratio. But say, for instance, most people in this room have a much more omega-6 on board than that, right? And which is almost certainly the case. What we're adding now to the dietary regime is chia seed, right? You can use flax. Flax and chia are the only two that I'm aware of plants that have a much higher ratio of omega-3 than omega-6. They run at 2 to 1, so they have twice as much omega-3 as omega-6, right? Whereas hemp, which is the next one down in the list, has 1/3 as much. So what we're doing is supplementing the hemp seed with chia in the short term, and by short term I mean for people who are well behind, it can be from 6 to say 24 months. It takes quite a while of constant correct dietary habits to rebuild yourself in the way that you need. But the reward for doing that is great, right? Things like age. You don't say, oh, I'm feeling old or something like that. You say, what's on today, right? It really does restore a sense of energy and purpose, right? You don't have to accept pain and disability in old age. That is a really sad, sad thing. You don't have to accept a Webster pack full of pills just to get through your day, right? There's a way out. The major advantage of the hemp seed, besides its high level of omega-3, is the cofactors that help you convert omega-3 in the basic form, the ALA form, into the elongated forms, the DHA and the EPA, which are the ones that incorporate into your brain, right? But do you get the idea? If you eat fish, even if that fish happens to have omega-3 and it's not come out of some stinking pond being fed rubbish, which is what most of them are, right? You're missing out on the whole range of benefits that these things can bring, and you're dependent on what you eat to regulate the amount of DHA EPA in respect of ALA. All right, don't worry about the details, but I think you get the broad principle there. Okay, but I was told, I was invited to attend a lecture run by Simplot some years ago. Has anyone heard of Simplot? Yeah? But everyone's heard of John West and Serena and all these other brands. Simplot owns them all, right? And that's what you'll find. A couple of corporations own everything and just have their little internal competitions. And what they did, they didn't actually invite me, I invited myself because I love a debate. But a dietitian friend of mine said, you might like to come and sort of put your tuppence worth in here, Andrew, which is what I did. 200 dietitians and all the people from Simplot saying that the only possible way of ingesting omega-3 was via their fish products. And I remember getting up and I said, well, you know, the Hunza people up in North Pakistan or wherever the Hunza people are in the Hunza Valley, they're some of the healthiest people on earth. They live strong and well into their 90s as a rule. And I said, they don't have a regular supply of your seafood. In fact, they've never seen a fish in their life, right? I left out a bit, which is really important. They came up with some science where they got 5 people, this was at Wollongong University, and they gave them some radio-labelled ALA. And then a day later, they scanned their brains and they couldn't find any radioactivity in their brain. So the way they presented it to these dietitians, see, humans can't elongate ALA. And when I got up, I said, there's a few little problems with your experiment. First, the 5 people, and we saw the photo, they're all overweight. And an excess intake of saturated fats interferes with the elongation of ALA. That's number one. Right? And number 2, and more important, if you don't have the essential cofactors, and the cofactors are the B group vitamins, they're magnesium, manganese, zinc, and a few other things, all present in abundant quantities in the hemp seed, you can then elongate the ALA when you need it, in the quantity you need it. Right? So it's much better to let the body sort things out properly than to take some stinking fish oil capsule at some outrageous price. If people actually saw how they make fish oil, have you got any idea what they do? After they've taken off all the saleable bits of the fish, they put these things in this hydraulic press and squeeze out this filthy, stinking sort of slush and then try and chemically purify it. It's pretty gross, and even if the chemical analysis shows that it's got some omega-3 in it, in the form of the DHA and EPA, it's probably degraded to a greater or lesser extent. So the take-home message is hemp and chia as a daily part of your life, right? Now, what we're doing too, and I took on board what Morgan was saying about juicing, and really juicing is not for everyone, but you can get a very similar effect. For instance, say you're growing at home, you've chosen or been advised to get the right plant, depending on what your specific condition is. You can then lightly dry the buds, vacuum pat them, ideally in a tin or something like that, so you keep them in their non-decarboxylated form, and then you can weigh out however much of that bud you want into a smoothie that has hemp seed and chia seed. They complement each other really well.
What about fresh frozen? Does freezing cannabis decarboxylate it?
No, and that's an option.
So,
That's an option, right?
The perfect option is to take it straight off your plant into the freezer and then use it as
Yeah. It's an issue. See, when people talk about leaves and things,
if you're going to partly dry your plant and then try and store it, you've got risk factor of mould. Whereas if you're taking fresh plant, putting it straight in the freezer, then nothing's going to happen.
oh, you can still get mould on fresh plant. You just
Not if it's frozen though.
no, the mould won't grow.
Yeah, but I mean, if you're picking it fresh and putting it straight in the freezer, I'm just saying it'd be easier to store it fresh frozen than trying to store it in jars.
Yeah. I tend not to say one thing's better than another because it comes down to horses for courses, right? I mean, people have juiced the cannabis or chopped it up and put in little aliquots in the freezer. It's really what works for you. But a rather easy way is to actually use the bud. Now, the advantage of that is you can get a very easy idea of what the dose is. Because, for instance, if you know you've got a 15% cannabinoid bud, if you take 1 gram of that, you know you're getting 150 milligrams. Right, so it's just an easy way to dose out. But even that's not that important because you titrate the dose anyway. Like everyone has been saying here, and it's good advice, you start low, don't go too slow, right? Because be aware that cannabis has a safety profile, and I was laughed at for saying this, but it's correct. It has a safety effect, in technical terms, safer than water. Right? No laughing. Right? Because it is. It's very true. Right? I mean, I've described this in court cases. It's what we call the LD50. The LD50, or lethal dose for 50% of the population, is a dose of any substance in terms of multiples of the usual therapeutic dose that'll kill half the population. Right? So say, for instance, what's an example? Alcohol. So say your normal dose of alcohol is, you know, say 5 drinks. If you have 5 times that, you may well die of alcoholic poisoning. So the LD50 is 5, right? The LD50 of cannabis has never been determined. In certain rat experiments, it was estimated at 40,000. The LD50 of water is between 10 and 20, right? There is nothing in human experience that comes close to the lack of toxicity of cannabis. Now, always be aware of the backlash, what I call the pig's backlash, because now they're talking about, oh, it's neurodevelopment and the human brain is not mature until 25, and even if we legalise cannabis, we shouldn't give it to children until they're 25 because their brains aren't mature. Well, the children that I've been dealing with, if you left it till 25, firstly, they'd be dead. And it's not what we see in the real world. What we see in the real world generally is an enhancement of their intelligence and a movement towards a full expression of how well they function. Right? But Mark Twain said, and I find it a really sad but very accurate saying, Mark Twain said, it's a lot easier to fool people than convince them they've been fooled. Right? Now, I'm just going to end on a political note because the psychopaths in the United States at this stage appear intent on dragging us into World War III. Right? Have you all been following this? The Americans have moved their aircraft carriers into the Gulf. Well, it's interesting, after that drone copped it, and when we talk about drones, we're not talking about some little optocopter or something like this. The Global Hawk has the wingspan the same as a big commercial airliner. It's a giant piece of work. The Americans have now withdrawn their forces out of missile range, which I find quite interesting. And the only positive thing I can come up with is some of the adults in the political world, like Putin and a few of the other statesmen that are around, are trying to create a cooperation, right, amongst nations that will counter this sort of headlong rush to global destruction, right? The only explanation I can have, so I don't want to bum this whole thing, but the right-wing psychopathic born-again Christians in the United States appear intent on a self-fulfilling prophecy of starting Armageddon and then during their little ascension, waft off to heaven and look at all us poor pot smokers suffering down in the mess that they've left it, right? But we deserve it because we're pot smokers, right? We can laugh, and you have to, but things are really, really serious, right? And you know what's more serious? It's the silence, right? The silence, right? I mean, I don't want to criticise anyone here, but who has said anything to anyone about the disaster that's looming? Good, mate. Next time I ask that question, yeah, I've done it many times, right? It may not. Oh, sorry. It may not make... What's closer? Oh, right, okay. It may not make a huge difference, but it's a crime against yourself to do nothing because you can only do a little bit, right? What did Simon and Garfunkel say? He says, "Fools, you say I do not know, silence like a cancer grows." It does, right? We're in a situation very analogous, but much more severe than, say, Germany in the 1930s. There was clearly a current for war, but everyone was well fed, they had their new car and all their Chinese plastic goods, so there was no need to say or do anything, right? And the rest is history, as they say, all right? So pick your topic, and there's a lot of very, very different issues that demand our attention. There's the microplastics in the reef, there's the degradation of the soils, there's the chopping down of the trees, there's just so many separate issues. But hey? 5G, oh Jesus Christ. I mean, I've moved to the country. I don't want to say I'm escaping, but I don't want to fight that battle. But if I was living in the city, they put up a 5G tower, I'd probably knock it down. That's how I feel. There has to be a line in the sand where we just don't take things passively, like rats in a cage while we die, right? But 5G is only one of the many serious threats that face humanity. Now, a little while ago, I actually got the use of a field strength meter, right? A little meter that regulates what the electric field strength is. And I just carried it around wherever I went in Sydney, and there was always a background, and every now and then it sort of went up quite substantially, but once in a while it just shot off the scale, right, at different places. And I got out and looked around and said, what's going on here? Off the scale. So there's much more. You know, I rarely quote Dennis Rumsfeld, but there's the things we know we don't know, and there's the things we don't know, right? Right? I mean, there's a lot of military activity that involves microwaves. They're developing them for crowd control. So the same technology that they're using. And why do we need 5G? Why haven't we got optical cable? Right? That's an investment that'll produce data streams that'll dwarf radio stuff, free of interference. Right? Sure, it might take a few extra years to roll out, but then you have an infrastructure that's good for decades. Hey? That's what we want to see. Right? I'll finish on this note, and we'll hear some questions if you want. But in a sense, I had a little debate with Richard Jones. I mean, Richard and I worked really closely together years ago when he was an independent. And, he was bemoaning the fact that things have gone so bad, and I pulled out that old quote that I think Kennedy dragged out at one stage. The only thing it takes for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. Right? I mean, most people feel relatively powerless at this stage. Right? That's a feeling I want you to get rid of. Right? A mouse that roars is better than a lion that's silent. Okay? Is it worth fighting for this planet? Is it worth fighting for your children? Of course it is. Right? So, on a practical level, right, if anyone gets into an indictable quantity cannabis charge by the police, talk to us, because we want to run those cases on the basis of jury nullification. Right? I have despaired with expecting a state or a federal government to change the cannabis laws in a meaningful way. I've simply despaired of that ever happening whilst the current set of crooks are in. Right? But we can use the power of a jury, as we demonstrated, to nullify the statute law. Now, that simply said is a jury doesn't have to give a verdict on the facts if they feel that the law is oppressive. And this is a fact that's been confirmed by the High Court. The only problem we're having at the moment is that the district courts, where most of these things are heard, are saying, yeah, we appreciate that that is the case. They can give that verdict, but you're not allowed to inform the jury that they have that power. Right? So they're trying to keep the blanket of silence on the fact that we have a way out of this mess. You imagine if we run 10 cases and the jury finds them not guilty, even though they're caught with, 100 plants, or like Morgan's dad with 107 plants. Not guilty, Your Honour. There's nothing the legal system can do about that. Once the jury has given a not guilty verdict, if they give a guilty verdict, you can appeal. But if they give a not guilty verdict, no power on earth can change that verdict. Right? So that's where I'm putting my energy at this stage. And I think if we run it right, there'll be a few little knocks and bruises on the way. But once we get that right entrenched, it gives us a power that will be very hard for the system to turn against. And we'll simply get to a stage where the cops won't arrest people. They'll walk away from it because they really don't like to lose. I mean, I was astounded at how much emotional energy went into the losing team when I got my not guilty verdict. I mean, the QC was throwing his wig on the ground and kicking his bloody duffel bag of stuff. It was really good. Right? It's worth it. Right? And I do think it's a way forward. It would be great if we had, say, movement at the United Nations level, and they are looking at rescheduling cannabis, right? Because at the moment, they used to say cannabis causes schizophrenia. Okay, at the last case I was at with Alex Dimitropoulos in the Gold Coast, here he was being charged with producing a dangerous drug to eat cannabis, and on the desk was a little pot of Canadian cannabis flowers which had been legally prescribed, right? So, who's the schizophrenic here? All right, well, that's all I've got to say for now. Does anyone want to ask the questions?
Yeah. I'm wanting to know how the hemp vibration is purifying contamination.
Say again?
How's the purifying the
Okay.
contamination?
Yeah.
Like started on that train at one
Okay, yeah. There is a bit of a complex issue here. Now, vibrations is one thing, that's at the metaphysical level, right? What cannabis can do, and people misunderstand that, it's used in remediation. So say you've got some cesium or some cadmium or some other heavy metals in the soil, and you plant cannabis, it can concentrate that in the roots and stems. But what people don't appreciate is then you have to burn that cannabis and concentrate the ash. It doesn't make it go away. People think you just plant the pot and then you're back to Eden. Wish, right? I wish, but it's not the case. Okay? Now, having said that, I don't want to knock a moto either, because there is something about a vibration. I mean, when I was young, the only thing I wanted to do was to grow some plants, just so they were there. And there is something at the metaphysical level. But I mean, as a scientist and a chemist, you have to say it doesn't get rid of heavy metals, it doesn't get rid of radionucleotides, but it does give you an opportunity, like a sponge, soaking these things up. So you can clean up the land and end up with a few buckets of poison.
What about, instead of burning, what about mulching very, very old forests? Because the old forest people have more knowledge how to disperse or take that up and get rid of it.
I don't follow.
Instead of burning the product...
Yeah, but if you mulch it, you're back where you started.
Yeah,
That's
old
a...
forests.
Hey?
Very old forests.
Yeah, but I mean, cadmium's cadmium, it's still there. I mean, if you're not using it for a food crop, it may not cause any problems. I mean, look, the only way to fix pollution is not do it. I mean, for Christ's sake, how hard is that? Right? And I mean, in terms of nuclear contamination, they can't even clean up plastic. Right? Although having said that, they can. There's bacteria. There's bacteria that can digest plastic. But why are we so slow to do some basic thing like banning plastic bags? Bloody India's banned plastic bags. And we can't? Are they that convenient and essential? I don't think so. I've gone most of my life without them, and I'm sure I can do the rest of it without them, right? We're just blind to the obvious and the truth.
So you say you moved out of the city and that. Have you prepared yourself like with a property that's like got your own water? And,
Yes. Yeah. Listen, I mean, we're doing it for another reason, because what I'm finding with people with very, very complex health problems, it's really hard to fix them in a standard doctor's consultation. Like, you can spend an hour with them and you can tell them to do this and that, but to change a lifetime and to completely reverse it, you need more hands-on. You need the actual physicality of gardens and things like that. But yeah, we're well on the way to becoming independent of the bastards, and then I can reinforce my activism. If they can't cut off your water, your sewage or your electricity, I say, nah.
I've got a medical question that's quite specific. It's about, I understand that THC can feed estrogen-fed cancers.
Hang on, THC.
Like, it's bad for certain cancers. Certain breast cancers, I don't know, maybe prostate cancer, well, the terminology I understand is pretty simple, but estrogen-fed cancers.
Yeah.
Now, my mother has HER2...
Let me see, hang on, it's not growing breasts, right? That's what they told us in the 60s, remember, that if you smoked cannabis, the men would grow breasts. Hey, do you remember that? That's, yeah. Can you give her a microphone, because I can't hear her?
Yes. No, can you come here and talk on the mic so we can hear?
Because this is an important question. Eh?
Yeah, okay. Talk in the mic.
Oh yeah. My question is, with HER2 positive breast cancer, which I'm confused about whether it's estrogen fed or not, is THC okay?
Now look, that's an easy one to answer half the question, right? The HER is nothing to do with estrogen, it's human epidermal receptor, right? And what they've done, what the cancer doctors are doing now that chemo's limitations have been well and truly reached, right? They're coming up with biologicals. So they look at a cancer and they look at what they call drivers. And certain of these cancers have epidermal receptors on them. And if they're overexpressed, that means there's more of them, they say that that's driving the cancer. So then they give you an antibody that blocks it. But that's not the same as estrogen reception. Now, there's no real estrogen stimulating effect from THC. That was put out by as far as I know, was put out by in the 60s. As I said, when they ran out. I mean, in one of my talks, I pointed this out, and this is really important, right? In the 1930s, they used to call cannabis the sex drug. And the reason why they banned it was because it increased people's libido and made women want to have sex with big black men. Right? Now, you laugh at it, but this is what it was all about. In the 60s, when like I say, that the libido enhancing effect wasn't as strong as we were hoping for, they changed their tune entirely and said it sapped your libido and made you apathetic. So in the space of 60 years, it's been banned for two diametrically opposite reasons. There's no real science in this, right? Now, having said that, the science of which cannabis is best for which cancer is a long way from being sorted out, right? And I'll just end with another cautionary tale. At this conference that we went to at the Gold Coast, right, one of the Israeli scientists showed a panel as one of his slides of about 5 of the common cancers, right? Prostate, breast, he had pancreas, I think bowel, and then about 10 different types of cannabis extracts. So just the plants, and some of them, say for instance melanoma, against melanoma, 4 of the types had very little effect against the melanoma, but one had almost 100% killing capacity. Now bearing in mind that was tissue culture, which doesn't always reflect what happens in the real world, but one was a standout, right? So I wandered along to him and said, hey mate, a lot of melanomas in this country, why don't you give me HPLC of that one and I'll put it together? Oh no, can't do that. Right, we're going to patent that at some future stage. So what good science is being done is being held onto for future financial, right? That's the trouble with a commercial system.
So just a quick comment, because this subject of breast cancer and THC and estrogen positive comes up again and again, and correct me if I'm wrong, but a very brief look on the research, There's only about one research article from the 70s that suggests that. But there is a wealth of upcoming research which suggests that it's not an issue.
But
So
the
you've got to be
lies
careful
stick.
where you get hung up on your research. So, and rather than spend a lot of time arguing it, you just got to not get hung up on the research.
Well, I disagree entirely because if it turns out that you're feeding a cancer when you think that you're healing a cancer, then I just don't. I've got
I'm just saying there's more recent research showing that it's not an issue.
Well, there's a lot of anecdotal information from people suffering from breast cancer, estrogen-fed breast cancers, that say that the THC they took has increased their cancer and then they go off it and then their tumours go down.
Geez, I'd like to talk to them.
Well, me too. Well, what you have to do then, there's a billion breast cancer Facebook pages with women putting comments on every day. And
For and against.
I've read it a lot. I read vastly alternative, mainstream, everything.
Yeah.
So,
Firstly, there's a bit of background.
I wouldn't take the risks.
The whole idea of estrogen as a driver of breast cancer, right? It may have a partial stimulating effect, but if estrogen was the sole driver, tamoxifen would be a lot better than what it actually is. And even if a cancer starts off as estrogen dependent or somewhat estrogen dependent, that's often lost during the evolution of the disease. See, people treat cancer like it just stays as how it starts.
Yeah.
The cancer is mutated by treatments, especially radiation and chemotherapy, right? So it always mutates down to a more primitive version, to a less controllable version. But yeah, that's as far as we can take that argument. But if you've got any credible stuff, I'd look at it, right? But
for me,
yeah.
science and anecdotal evidence, I prefer the anecdotal evidence myself, really, even though the people may not be able to scientifically explain why this has happened.
Yeah.
The fact that it has happened is equal to me.
Now, hang on.
Science.
The word anecdote is something that has been thrown at me over the years.
I agree.
And look, when they talk about, say for instance, Morgan here, that would be brushed off as an anecdotal evidence.
Exactly.
It's not even using the word properly. An anecdote is usually a second-hand report of something. What we're dealing with here is direct clinical experience. In a court of law, the only thing the court accepts is what a person says. They're asked a question and they're told an answer.
Well, I agree.
Yeah.
Anecdote is the wrong word. These are women who are describing their own experience.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think we should spend half an hour debating
Thank
whether
you.
THC
But-
causes breast cancer, but definitely I think there's...
But thank you for giving me that time.
That's
But
okay.
I must, in my experience, I've not seen the initiation of cannabis followed by a rapid exacerbation. But I mean, everyone's experience is limited, right? And one thing, I hold on to truth. I hold on to current opinions rather loosely, right? Because if evidence comes up, we have to abandon them. Okay.
Women, not people.
What are some small steps we can do to fight little mouths?
Could you speak up?
Sorry?
What are some small steps we could do to help this out?
You're talking about the world, saving the world.
Well, like we were saying,
Yeah.
fight little mouths, because I sort of do it before people just seem to be stoner, so that I sort of like stop.
Okay. Everyone, I mean, really you have to operate within your capacity as well, right? I mean, some of us are sort of loudmouth front people, but not everyone is, right? Small people is education, for instance. I mean, for instance, if the hemp party's running, you know, you might receive literature from the embassy and talk it up with other people, right? I mean, the old-fashioned thing of writing a letter to the pollies, it's getting less and less important. In the old days, it was mandatory that they had to send you a reply. Now I'm told barefaced, and I'm sure Morris had the same experience, unless they get a couple of hundred, they won't even reply, right? So what can I say? Really just talking about it, just introducing the topic, right? It's like the mouse that roared. You know, one mouse doesn't make much noise, but 1,000 make a lot of noise, right? Yeah.
I'm going to have to interrupt him, I think. It's fantastic. You realise that we are the two hemp New South Wales Senate candidates. I just realised that. You're going to be here tomorrow? He's a total wealth of knowledge. I really appreciate you coming. Have you seen that he's written a book? And it's out there, and I'm assured it's excellent.
Let me zoom in on it.
The life experiences and accumulated wisdom of a hemp activist. Just straight to the point. That's the way he is.
Can I speak a few words about it?
You
just
can,
very briefly.
and then Malcolm's coming up.
Okay. What I've tried to do with this, I mean, you try and make something a little bit amusing to get people's attention, but what I wanted to do is describe. I'll just get rid of this. Introduce topics that have been hit by the censor in this country. Immunisation. Right? What I've tried to do is to provide a rational middle position on immunisation, euthanasia, fluoridation. Right? These are big topics that we're not even allowed to discuss. Right? So within the context of my life, I've really shown how I've arrived at different views and what they mean. I think it's got some value. I mean, yeah.
I haven't read it all, but
I don't think a tree died in vain.
People I've given it to love it, so I recommend you buy a copy. How about 25 or 30 bucks out there?
Yeah.
So and he will sign it if you buy it today.
Yeah. All right.
Anyway, thanks heaps, Andrew. Thanks very much. Is Malcolm here? I saw Malcolm.
Right, right behind
Here
you.
he is.
Yep.
So I've gone over time, but we can go over time. I don't care about the time. The movie's on at 6:30. We're not talking till then. But I hope people stay for the movie. It'll be interesting, I'm sure. And you've been part of the movie and know about the movie.
Yeah.
But more so, this man has a fantastic